Bernie Sanders was on the Sunday shows over the weekend, and he was making the case for why his supporters should back Joe Biden. Let's take a listen.
So I think that Joe and his staff understand that. I think they are going to reach out to our supporters and come up with an agenda that speaks to the needs of working families, of young families, of minority communities.
We'll see. As we've covered here, color me skeptical given the fact that, look, here we are in the midst of the pandemic. Joe says he wants to be the next FDR. Like, you could do it right now. You could lay out what you want your approach to be. But even at a deeper level, I've been thinking a lot about, like, the end of the Sanders campaign. I actually watched this Bernie Blackout doc that we're featured in, by the way, that talks about how that all went down. And so I've been thinking about post that campaign that not only did Bernie end up getting out of the race before, myself and many others thought that he should, that he didn't press Joe for anything other than the task forces. And then he's gone that extra step of essentially shaming anyone who would hold strong and say, look, I've got principles, like things that are important to me that Joe Biden doesn't value and support and hasn't shown me any indication that he is going to value and support. And that Bernie has gone that extra mile of like shaming those individuals, to me, has done more to undermine and really destroy the energy of that movement. Like, they couldn't have crushed that movement on their own. He was integral in like destroying the energy and momentum of that movement. And then you see, on Friday, the few progressives in the House trying to quash the stupid, terrible bill that
muster 14 votes.
Corporate lobbyist bill. And they can only muster 14 votes. Actually, on the actual bill, Pramila Jayapal was the only one that voted against it. These things are all related because there was this coherent, energetic movement, and it's just been like totally dissipated and crushed. Bernie's part of the reason why. I hate to say it.
No, you're right. And I think what's interesting about him is that he's kind of fell into the Trump trap of becoming all things to all people. So to Washington people who were sympathetic to Bernie's social positions and some of his economic positions, he was the guy who played the inside ball, was part of the Democratic leadership, who worked within that, the amendment king, and was somebody who was fundamentally on the team. He backed Joe Biden. He was the person who, he said, I would vote for Joe. I will vote for the Democratic nominee. And then to others, to some of the people who watch this show, I think to yourself, it was somebody who was willing to go totally up against the establishment. I mean, he had that tweet, proclaiming, I'm a news for the Democratic establishment. I got news to the Republican establishment. But to people within the Democratic establishment who were sympathetic, they liked Bernie because he was willing to play ball with them. And they look at people who supported him for being a total anti-establishmentarian as fools who didn't really understand the real Bernie. And this kind of like has broken out on Twitter recently. Matt Iglesias over at Fox, he tweets, as somebody who admires Bernie Sanders a great deal and shares his views about this election, I actually care a great deal about the Bernie left brand and think it belongs to people who agree with Bernie Sanders. What he's talking about there is about people who are going to vote for Joe Biden. This is something that Matt has been really incensed about. He's not a big fan of this show, thinks we're a secret plot in order to make sure that people don't vote, which is real galaxy brain take. But if you look at what he's really saying there, I think he falls very much into that latter camp of supporting Sanders. I mean, look, Matt is, it's a long-time neoliberal shill, all that, who kind of grafts onto the Sanders movement and is like, I support Bernie. He makes the case for Bernie, like all this. But the moment that Bernie's like, we got to go for Biden, he comes on board and starts really like vilifying people like Elizabeth Brunig and others who were, posing doubts about Biden, saying that they are irresponsible actors and et cetera. And I think it's that Sanders that they very much want to graft onto. The Sanders that was in Democratic leadership. The Sanders who fundamentally was a Democrat at heart. Whereas I think that the others, Brunig, people like yourself, look at it and say, I supported this man and his movement very much because he was antagonistic to that establishment. And I think that in the elite level, the Iglesiases of the world who support Sanders are far overrepresented as to the normal people who supported Sanders from the very beginning. And this is same with Trump. It's like the same thing. People who grafted onto Trump, who was like, oh, Trump says he's for tax cuts and all that. The Republican establishment, very much willing, and many conservative thinkers who, found Trump anathema are willing to, go along and were willing to support him for these convenient reasons, whereas the vast majority of the people who support Trump did so for all of the reasons that the establishment did not.
See, I see it as a little bit different. And Glenn Greenwald also got in a fight with Matt Iglesias over the weekend that I would encourage you all to check out on Twitter. And basically, Iglesias was trying to go after him of like, oh, you're being a hypocrite on drone strikes, which have increased under the Trump administration, but you haven't bothered to say anything. And Glenn was able to point to like 4 articles immediately where he was like, this is terrible, drone strikes have increased. But the point that Glenn essentially was making is like, some of us have like consistent principles that aren't about like the charisma or identity of one particular person. Whereas a lot of the commentariat here and like the Democratic operatives and political journalists, they're on Team Blue no matter what. Yeah. Right? And so if Team Blue's principles move, their principles move, right? And you see that over the years. They don't call out their own side when they violate their principles because ultimately they don't really have principles. They're just on this team and they will defend that team, period, end of story. And so with Bernie, during the primary, they treated him because he did use some of that rhetoric. And in some senses, he was a threat to the sort of established order here because the people who, you know, had access and the gravy train and all of that, like they would have been put out of those prime positions. That is true. So they treated him like he was, you know, a nuclear explosion and he was the worst thing that could happen. And he's so radical and this is awful, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that you know, some of us saw that reaction to him as like a good thing, like, oh, they actually see him as a threat, and he's saying that he would be a threat. What's been revealed at the end of his campaign, which, you know, some people saw from the beginning, I would say Jimmy Dore saw like from the beginning, is that he actually had become more of a conventional Democrat. After 2016, they were able to pretty effectively co-opt him. Like they gave him a leadership position in the, you know, within the Democratic caucus in the Senate. He became more of that like team player. And so some of the rhetoric that he used on the trail was almost like a relic of a previous, more antagonistic version of himself when he really was more of this like outsider, gadfly, et cetera. And so now that he's no longer a threat, people like Iglesias are like, oh, the Bernie left, I love the Bernie left, et cetera, et cetera. And they're so confused by anyone like myself who, you know, was supportive of the direction of the Sanders movement during the primary, who would have a critique now because they can't wrap their head around the fact that, no, like, I have a certain worldview and certain principles. It wasn't, my worldview was not, I agree with whatever Bernie Sanders says or does. Like, I have a set of principles, and those are independent of Bernie Sanders or AOC or, you know, the Squad or anyone else. It's hard for them to wrap their heads around because in their worldview, it's just like, I am on this team and whatever this team does, those are my principles. So it doesn't like, they see that, and this goes back to your thing of like, he thinks we're a Republican plan, we're just trying to get people not to vote or whatever. It's because if you can't wrap your head around, oh, this person has principles and that's what they're acting according to, then it must be some kind of like nefarious plot paid for by the Kremlin or whatever your conspiracy theory of the day is.
Yeah, it's always a conspiracy theory to have heterodox opinions in Washington. That's really what it comes down to. Which is, if you don't play for your team, then you're immediately cast out as a freak. And you have all of these things that are not available to you that are available to people like him. And it becomes an internecine like warfare of being like, oh, you don't agree with Bernie. It's like, well, no. I mean, like, people don't support people because of who they are. And they don't go along with everything they say. They go along with somebody because they agree with the majority of the things that they say. And when they turn away from the things that they said and have said for a long time, it's okay to criticize.
Right. And people who watch the show, I think, would know that, you know, I and others were critical of Bernie at times, both in terms of his tactics. I mean, I was critical on, you know, his approach to the war on drugs and pushed him there. I mean, it's not like this was just, oh, everything Bernie says is great. So if you were aware of that, you wouldn't be surprised that there would continue to be criticism after the primary ended. But the reality is people like Matt were happy to trash him when he was a threat during the primary. Now that he's bent the knee, they're like, how can you dare like, how can you dare critique him? Yeah. How dare you? You know, when they were like, you know, chief critics
I mean,
all
Matt
the way along.
was on board with Sanders. Maybe
he was pretty critical.
I don't really know.
Yeah.
But, yeah.
But people like him. We're not just explicitly picking on Matt here. It's just one of those things that illustrates a sort of broader dynamic that's interesting to dive into.
It's a really interesting one.
More Rising for you after this.